The scaffold was ready. 5 men would die in a single morning, their blood soaking Tower Hill's execution block. But they were the lucky ones. Henry VIII had shown them mercy, a quick death by the axe. Others accused of touching his wives weren't so fortunate. They faced something far worse, hung by the neck but cut down alive, watching as executioners tore their bodies apart piece by piece. If you think you know Tudor brutality, think again. Hit that subscribe button, because what you about to discover will make you grateful you weren't born in Henry VIII's England. Mark Smeaton was never meant to be part of the story of kings and queens. He was a talented young musician, the kind of man who filled the Tudor court with music and color, not politics and blood. One day he was playing for nobles in glittering chambers. The next he was being watched far too closely by men who served a very different purpose. In a world where birth decided almost everything, Smeaton was an outsider who had somehow slipped into the inner circle of power, and that made him vulnerable. At Henry VIII's court, access was everything. Servants, musicians, and attendants moved in and out of royal apartments, always seen, rarely noticed. Smeaton was one of those shadows in the background of Anne Boleyn's life, a face the Queen might recognize, a name she might barely remember, but one that others could twist into something far more dangerous. When rumors began to coil around Anne, they needed men low enough that no one would defend them, yet close enough that the story would sound believable. Mark Smeaton fit that role perfectly. In the spring of 1536, tension at court was thick and unspoken. Anne was no longer the radiant new queen who had stolen Henry's heart. She was a woman whose failure to produce a surviving male heir had turned that same heart cold. Powerful enemies watched her every move, waiting for the moment they could move against her. For men like Smeaton, this shift was deadly. The gossip that once meant nothing could suddenly become treason. A smile, a glance, a careless word, anything could be turned into evidence. When Smeaton was finally taken for questioning, it did not happen in public. There was no grand accusation, no formal scene. He simply disappeared into the machinery of Tudor justice, the kind that worked behind locked doors and heavy stone walls. What happened inside those rooms was never fully recorded, and that silence is as telling as any document. Later accounts would claim that he was pressured, threatened, perhaps even physically forced into saying what his interrogators wanted to hear. Whatever the methods, the outcome was devastatingly clear. Mark Smeaton confessed to adultery with the Queen. That single confession was worth more to Henry's ministers than any real investigation. It was the foundation stone for the case that would destroy Anne Boleyn and drag several other men down with her. Smeaton's status made him the perfect starting point. If a mere musician claimed intimacy with the Queen, then the leap to accusing nobles and courtiers was much easier to sow. His words, once spoken, could not be taken back. Whether he believed he might save himself, or whether he simply broke under pressure, no one at court truly cared. With his confession, the story of Anne's supposed betrayal had its first crucial piece, and the path to the scaffold was set in motion. When Mark Smeaton confessed, the story did not stop with him. It widened fast. His words gave Henry's ministers exactly what they needed: a starting point, a pattern they could build into something much bigger. Once a single man admitted to being too close to the Queen, it suddenly became possible to claim that others had done the same. But this time, they did not look at low-born musicians. They turned their attention to the men who moved at the very center of power around Henry and Anne. The first name to fall into the net was Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry VIII's closest companions. Norris was no background figure. He was a trusted courtier, a man who shared the king's private moments, hunts, and conversations. That kind of intimacy with the monarch made the accusation even more explosive. If Henry's own friend could be painted as a man who secretly desired the Queen, it sent a message that no bond, not even friendship with the king, could protect you once suspicion took hold. Then came Sir Francis Weston, younger, charming, and popular at court. He was known for his easy manner and for moving comfortably in the Queen's social circle. A casual remark here, a jest there. Things that once would have meant nothing could now be twisted into signs of forbidden interest. William Brereton, a powerful figure in the Welsh marshes, was also drawn in. His inclusion shows that this was no simple moral scandal, but a political sweep. Removing Brereton helped the crown extend its control over regions where he had influence. Each new name added a different type of man to the list. A friend, a favorite, a regional power. The most shocking accusation of all was reserved for George Bullen, Lord Rochford, the Queen's own brother. By accusing him, the prosecution was not just suggesting adultery, but incest, and a conspiracy that reached into the heart of the Bullen family. It created a picture of a corrupt household, rotting from the inside. To the public, it made Anne's supposed guilt look more plausible. To Henry, it offered something even more useful, a total destruction of the family he now wanted removed from his life. Taken together, these men formed a carefully selected group. They were not random. Each one had a position that mattered in the king's chamber, in regional politics, in the Queen's orbit, or in her bloodline. Smeaton's confession allowed the crown to link them all under a single deadly charge, that they had betrayed their king by sharing an intimacy, real or imagined, with his wife. None of them had solid evidence against them, no letters, no eyewitness accounts that would stand up to real scrutiny. But in a court where the king's suspicion weighed more than any proof, the pattern was enough. With the list of alleged lovers complete, the next step was inevitable. Trials that were less about discovering the truth and more about confirming the story the crown had already decided to tell. By the time the net had closed around Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, and George Bullen, the outcome was already tilting in one direction. They were not treated like men whose innocence or guilt was still an open question. They were treated like pieces in a story that had already been written. All that remained was to give that story a stage. That stage was the courtroom, not a quiet chamber, but a public arena where the crown could display its power and make an example of them. Their trials were held at Westminster, in front of a packed audience of nobles, officials, and observers who understood exactly how dangerous it was to be too close to a falling queen. The atmosphere was less about seeking the truth and more about showing loyalty. Juries were drawn from men who owed their positions and futures to the king. Those chosen to sit in judgment knew what was expected of them. When the case was presented, it came with a weight that was impossible to ignore. This was not just about 5 men. It was about proving that Henry VIII had been wronged. The charges were read out in chilling detail. Each man was accused of committing adultery with Anne Boleyn, and through that supposed betrayal, plotting treason against the king. The accusations claimed that they had used their alleged intimacy with the queen to conspire, to imagine the king's death, or to weaken his rule. There were dates, places, and carefully constructed narratives, but very little that would pass as solid proof. For most of them, the evidence was built from suggestions, interpretations, and the confession already pried from Mark Smeaton. When it came time to speak, only Smeaton accepted the role the prosecution had written for him. He pleaded guilty, the lone voice admitting to what the crown wanted confirmed. The others refused to bend. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and George Bullen all protested their innocence, denying that they had ever touched the queen or conspired against their king. Their words were calm, measured, and often dignified, but everyone in the hall knew that the verdict did not truly lie in their hands. The king's will was not physically in the room, but it was felt in every corner. The sentences, when pronounced, were as heavy as possible. All 5 men were condemned as traitors, and with that word came the traditional punishment for high treason. It was not a simple death. It was the harshest sentence the law allowed, a way of marking them not just as criminals, but as enemies of the crown itself. The judgment ensured that their end would be public, humiliating, and final. For now, though, they were led away from Westminster knowing exactly what awaited them. The legal part of the performance was complete. The next act would move from the courtroom to the place where sentences were carried out, and where the king still had one more decision to make about how each of them would die. On the morning chosen for their deaths, London woke to the quiet knowledge that 5 men were about to vanish from its world. News moved fast in Tudor England, not through papers or posters, but through whispered talk in markets, along the river, at church doors. By the time the sun climbed above the tower, people already knew the names: Norris, Weston, Brereton, Smeaton, and George Bullen. Their fate had been sealed in Westminster, but this was the part everyone would remember, the moment judgment turned into something real, cold, and irreversible. They were not taken to a common gallows. Instead, a scaffold had been raised on Tower Hill, the place reserved for high-status traders. It stood just outside the tower's walls, visible to a controlled but significant crowd. Soldiers kept order, but there was no mistaking the mood. People had come not only to see men die, but to see what it meant to be accused of betraying Henry VIII. The message mattered as much as the execution. These were not nameless criminals. They were men who had moved beside the king, a queen's brother, a royal favorite, a musician whose confession had lit the fuse. George Bullen, as a nobleman and the queen's brother, went first. Rank decided order even at the edge of death. He climbed the scaffold, knowing that his sister was imprisoned within the tower, waiting for her own sentence to be carried out. Contemporary accounts describe him speaking at length, addressing the crowd in the formal, careful style expected of a condemned noble. He did not openly attack the king or the process that had brought him there. Instead, he focused on his sins in general terms, on faith, and on the idea of submitting to justice. In Tudor England, even a final speech was part of the performance, a chance to show obedience in death, if not in life. After George came Henry Norris, the king's former companion. His presence on that scaffold showed just how far Henry's anger had spread. A man who had once ridden beside the king now stood marked as a traitor. Sources suggest that Norris held to his innocence, yet accepted his fate with a restraint that would have been noted by everyone watching. Francis Weston and William Brereton followed, each stepping into the narrow space between life and the waiting axe. They had different backgrounds, different roles at court, but in this moment they were equal. All were examples of what happened when suspicion touched the king's inner circle. Mark Smeaton, the lowest born of them all, is believed to have died last. The musician whose confession had helped build the entire case was now standing at its final edge. Unlike the others, he had already admitted guilt, and he did not publicly withdraw those words before the end. Whether that was fear, resignation, or something more complicated is lost to history. What remains is the bleak irony. The man whose statement had been so useful to the crown received the same ultimate penalty as those who had denied everything. Because they were of gentle or important status, their original sentence, the full, drawn-out punishment for treason, was reduced. Instead, they were beheaded, a cleaner and quicker death than the law first promised them. Even that mercy served a purpose. It showed that the king could still distinguish between ranks, rewarding birth and position with a less brutal end, even while destroying the men who held them. Within the tower, Anne Boleyn was close enough to feel the reverberation of what had happened. The fall of these 5 men cleared the path for her own execution. Their blood washed away the last obstacles between Henry and the freedom he wanted, leaving behind a court that understood, more clearly than ever, how thin the line was between favor and ruin. Before Henry VIII ever laid eyes on Catherine Howard, her story was already being pulled in a dangerous direction by the people around her. She did not grow up in a royal palace, but in the noisy, crowded household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. It was a place where young nobles were sent to be raised and trained for court, but supervision was careless and inconsistent. Girls and boys slept in nearby chambers. Adults came and went, and reputations were as fragile as candle flames. In that world, Catherine was just another girl from a powerful family, not yet a queen, not yet a target. Among the men who moved through that household was Francis Derham. He was older than Catherine, confident, and familiar enough with the servants and young women that his presence did not raise alarms at first. What began between them was not a brief flirtation watched over by careful chaperones. It developed in corners and late hours, in a setting where boundaries were blurred and authority often looked the other way. Over time, their relationship moved beyond innocent talk. They shared private moments, grew physically close, and treated each other less like distant acquaintances and more like a pair who belonged together. In that environment, words mattered almost as much as actions. Catherine and Derham began to call each other husband and wife, a form of address that, in Tudor culture, could carry serious weight. For some, it was just a way of speaking. For others, it could be taken as an informal promise, something close to a binding pre-contract. For a young woman of Catherine's status, that kind of language, combined with physical intimacy, was dangerous. It created a shadow over her future that she could not yet see. At the time, neither she nor Derham had any reason to imagine that one day a king would care about what passed between them in that house. What happened between Catherine and Derham took place before she ever wore a crown or shared a bed with Henry VIII. To them, it was a secret, private relationship in a semi-chaotic noble household, not an act against a king. But in a world obsessed with a woman's honor, it left marks that could be used later. When Catherine eventually rose to become queen, her past did not simply disappear. It followed her, waiting to be uncovered and reinterpreted by people who had very different motives than a love-struck young couple. The words they once used in private, husband, wife, would later be dragged into the harsh light of royal investigation, turned into evidence that her body and loyalty had not always belonged to the king alone. Years later, when Catherine Howard walked into Henry VIII's court as a young, captivating bride, the world she entered was the complete opposite of the loose, half-supervised household she had grown up in. Everything at court was performance. Every look, every gesture, every word spoken in the king's presence could be read and judged. To Henry, she was the perfect antidote to his age and disappointment, youthful, affectionate, and as far as he believed, untouched. He called her his rose without a thorn, a symbol of purity and renewal. But beneath the silks and jewels, the past she carried from her grandmother's house had not vanished. It had only gone quiet. That silence did not last. In 1541, fragments of Catherine's earlier life began to surface, first as murmurs and as formal reports. People who had known her before she became queen remembered what the court wanted to pretend had never existed. The late-night meetings, the shared bed, the way she and Francis Derham had spoken to each other like a married couple. Those memories reached the ears of men whose job was to protect the king's honor. Suddenly, what had once been a hidden relationship between two young people became something far more dangerous. Evidence that the king's wife had not come to him as the untouched bride he believed her to be. Once questions were raised, the investigation widened quickly. Derham was dragged back into Catherine's life, not as a lover, but as a suspect. So was another man, Thomas Culpeper, a handsome courtier who had grown close to Catherine while she was already queen. Unlike Derham, whose intimacy with her belonged to the period before her marriage, Culpeper was tied to secret meetings and late-night conversations during her time as Henry's wife. That difference would become crucial. The crown began to separate Catherine's life into before and after Henry, and to weigh her actions in each. There was even a third name in the shadows, Henry Mannix, a music tutor from her youth who had behaved inappropriately with her, but had never gone as far as Derham. His involvement showed just how thoroughly Catherine's past was being examined. Every man who had ever crossed a line with her in any way was now being questioned, sorted, and judged according to how dangerous his connection to her looked in the present. Mannix, whose behavior had been improper but limited, would eventually be set aside. Derham and Culpeper, however, were pulled into the center of the storm. By the time the interrogations were fully underway, the line between private memory and official accusation had been completely erased. What Catherine and Derham had once treated as a hidden, personal bond was now being dissected by counselors and lawyers whose sole priority was the king's honor and security. The words husband and wife, spoken years earlier in a different house and a different life, were written down, repeated, and turned into the heart of a case. For Henry, the question was no longer just what his queen had done before he married her, but what that past said about her, worthiness to sit beside him now, and what should happen to the men who had ever been close enough to claim a part of her story. When the council finally decided to act, the shift was sudden and merciless. One day Catherine Howard was Henry's adored young queen. The next she was surrounded by suspicion. Her chambers searched, her servants questioned. The warmth and laughter of her household were replaced by the cold rhythm of interrogation. People who had once bowed and smiled now weighed every answer, terrified of being caught on the wrong side of the truth. In that tightening circle, Frances Derham's name was no longer a half-forgotten detail from her youth. It was a thread the king's counselors began to pull with both hands. Derham was hauled in and confronted with accusations that reached back years. He did not deny that he had been close to Catherine before she became queen. In fact, he tried to claim that closeness as a kind of protection. He argued that their relationship had been serious, that their use of husband and wife meant something like a promise, even a form of pre-contract. If that were accepted, then Catherine's later marriage to Henry might be seen as flawed in law, not as deliberate deceit. In Derham's mind, that argument might save them both. In reality, it gave the investigators something far more useful. A way to say that another man had touched the king's wife first. At the same time, evidence about her present life began to harden around Thomas Culpeper. Where Derham belonged to her past, Culpeper belonged to the dangerous now. Servants and attendants spoke of late-night meetings, secret passages, hushed conversations, while the king slept elsewhere. Letters and testimonies suggested emotional intimacy, and possibly more. The crown did not need to prove every detail. It only needed to paint a picture strong enough for Henry to believe that his trust had been betrayed in the most personal way. Between Derham and Culpeper, investigators could argue that Catherine had never truly been the untouched bride. Henry thought he had married, and that she had not stayed loyal to him once she wore the crown. As the questioning deepened, the tone around Derham changed. At first, he looked like a man trying to assert a past claim, perhaps even hoping to turn the situation into a legal technicality about contracts and consent. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became that everything he admitted could be turned against him. His story confirmed that Catherine had shared herself with him long before the king, and that he had come back into her life after she became queen, asking for a place in her household. To Henry's counselors, that did not look like a man stepping away from a former lover. It looked like someone trying to profit from it. By the time formal charges were drawn up, the roles were brutally simple. Culpeper was framed as the queen's current favorite, the man whose closeness to Catherine threatened the king in the present. Derham was cast as the one who had deflowered her before she ever reached the royal bed, staining the image of purity Henry believed he possessed. What had once been a complicated, messy human story, a young woman's past, tangled affections, uneven power, was compressed into a clear, sharp narrative of dishonor and betrayal. That narrative did not just decide Catherine's fate. It set the stage for the punishment that would fall on the men who had ever been close enough for the crown to call them guilty. When the crown finally moved from questioning to judgment, everything that had been whispered about Catherine Howard and the men around her was dragged into the open. The king's counselors gathered the pieces of her past and present into a single damning story and carried it into the formal setting of a treason trial. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were no longer simply names linked to a young woman's private life. They stood accused of acts that supposedly struck at the heart of the monarchy itself. What had once been hidden in corridors and country houses was now being spoken in a hall where every word could cost a life. Under English law, the charges went far beyond personal immorality. Derham and Culpeper were indicted for treason, not just for any physical or emotional closeness to the Queen, but because that closeness was framed as an attack on the king's body and honor. Culpeper was accused of seeking to have known the Queen while she was married to Henry. His late-night meetings and conversations turned into proof of a forbidden intimacy. Derham, on the other hand, was painted as the man who had possessed her before the king, then forced his way back into her world by demanding a place in her household once she was queen. Together, they allowed the prosecution to argue that Catherine had never truly belonged to Henry alone, before or after the wedding. In court, both men tried to navigate a path through the accusations, but their positions were very different. Culpeper admitted to seeking private time with Catherine and to sharing dangerous familiarity, while stopping short of confessing to full adultery. Derham held to the line that what had happened between him and Catherine took place before she ever became queen, insisting that he had not shared that level of intimacy with her once she was married to Henry. Yet in the logic of Tudor justice, those distinctions mattered far less than the image painted for the king, his wife entangled with other men across different stages of her life, and those men daring to stay near her even after she wore his ring. The court found both of them guilty. After the verdict, a terrible hierarchy of punishment took shape. The same pattern that had marked the fall of Anne Boleyn's alleged lovers appeared again, but with a sharper edge. Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, received a form of mercy. His sentence was altered so that he would be beheaded. It was still a public, shattering end, but it was a cleaner, quicker death reserved for those of higher rank. Francis Derham was shown no such favor. His role as the man who had been with Catherine before Henry, and then returned to her service, made him, in the king's eyes, the one who had taken something that could never be restored. That difference in treatment is where Henry's personal fury shows most clearly. Two men were condemned under the same law, in the same case, tied to the same queen, yet their deaths were deliberately separated into lesser and worse. Culpeper's fate matched his status. Derham's matched the depth of the king's resentment. It was not enough that they should die. Their ends had to reflect exactly how Henry wanted their stories remembered. One as a reckless favorite who had overstepped, the other as the man who had touched what the king believed should always have been his alone. And with their sentences set, the path led away from the courtroom toward the place where Tudor justice would make that distinction visible to everyone watching. In Henry VIII's England, the word traitor did more than decide whether a man lived or died. It decided how he would meet his end, what the crowd would see, and how long his story would be remembered afterward. By the time Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were condemned, that system was already well established. The law did not just say, "You will be executed." It laid out, step by step, a ritual designed to strip a man of honor, body, and even identity. To understand what Henry really chose for the men accused of touching his wives, you have to understand that ritual. A traitor's journey began before the scaffold came into view. Once sentenced, he was no longer treated like an ordinary criminal. He was taken from the safety of stone walls and handed over to a different kind of theater, the open streets. For common-born or lower-ranking men, the route from prison to the place of death was deliberate and slow. They were tied or chained to a wooden hurdle or sledge and dragged behind a horse through the city. Crowds lined the way, not just to stare, but to participate, shouting, cheering, sometimes throwing whatever came to hand. It was humiliation by design, a rolling message that the king's enemies could be pulled through the mud before they were ever touched by a blade. The destination for these punishments was often a place like Tyburn, a site outside the city where executions were a regular public spectacle. People in London knew what it meant when a group of men was dragged out that far. They were not just going to die, they were going to serve as a warning. The physical journey through the streets turned them into living announcements. Traitors are being taken to their end, and this is what happens if you cross your king. By the time they reached the gallows, they were already exhausted, bruised, and very aware that every eye was on them. Yet even at this stage, the system allowed for difference. High-born men like Norris or Culpeper, or those whom the king chose to favor, could be spared the worst parts of that procession. They might be taken more quietly from the tower to a scaffold on Tower Hill or another controlled space, avoiding the dragged journey and some of the public degradation. The law technically demanded the same ultimate sentence for all convicted traitors, but in practice, Henry could adjust how much pain and spectacle each man endured. That gap between what the law prescribed and what the king allowed is where his personal feelings showed. For someone like Francis Derham, that distinction was crucial. He was not just convicted of treason on paper. He was treated as the man whose crime cut straight across Henry's pride. The legal framework gave the crown a scale of punishments to work with. At one end stood the relative mercy of a quick beheading on a raised scaffold, the kind of death associated with gentlemen and noblemen. At the other stood the full, extended ritual reserved for those the king wanted to make an example of. Section by section, that ritual would turn a single sentence of treason into a layered experience of fear, shame, and destruction. And in the next parts of your video, that is where Derham's path will lead. In Tudor law, the cruelty of a traitor's sentence was disguised as procedure. Once a man had been dragged through the streets to the place of execution, the next stage began with something that looked familiar. A hanging, a rope, a beam, a drop. But for traitors, that moment was not meant to be the end. It was only the midpoint in a carefully structured ritual that balanced on a thin line between life and death. The condemned man was lifted or dropped so that the rope tightened around his neck, cutting off breath and clouding his vision. Unlike ordinary hangings, the goal here was not a clean, swift breaking of the neck. It was to bring the traitor to the edge of death, to the point where the world narrowed to pressure, panic, and fading sound. The crowd watched as he kicked and struggled, knowing this was not yet the final act. Every second he spent dangling there deepened the sense that he was being punished, not just removed. At a chosen moment, the executioner or his assistants intervened. The man was cut down while still alive, his body limp and gasping on the ground. That sudden return of air, the shock of impact, the confusion, these were all part of the design. The law required that he be alive for what followed. The hanging was not meant to be merciful. It was meant to weaken him, to remind everyone present that the king's justice could pull a man back from the brink just to continue the sentence. From there, the ritual moved from public disgrace into something more controlled, almost clinical in its coldness. The traitor, half-conscious and struggling, was positioned so that the next stages of punishment could be carried out in front of the watching crowd. In theory, the purpose was symbolic as much as physical. The body of the enemy was being dealt with in stages, each one meant to send a message about loyalty, obedience, and the cost of betraying the crown. What made this especially chilling is that the law allowed room for choice. The full sequence partial hanging, further mutilation, and final dismemberment was the standard prescribed for high treason. But the king could intervene at any point to lessen it. If Henry wanted to show a measure of favor, a man might be allowed to die fully on the rope, or be executed by a clean beheading instead. If he wanted to make an example, the process would go on exactly as written, step by step. For men tied to his queens, that distinction mattered more than anything. It decided whether their last experience was a brief moment at the scaffold, or a drawn-out passage through carefully staged suffering that the entire city was invited to witness. Once the rope had done its work and the traitor lay alive, but broken on the ground. The punishment shifted from a display of control over his breath to a statement about his body itself. The crowd had already watched him dragged through the streets and half-hanged in front of them. Now they were about to see what the law truly meant when it said that treason struck at the king's very person. Every step that followed was designed to show that no part of a traitor belonged to him anymore. The first cuts were not random. They were symbolic, aimed at the parts of the body that carried meaning in a world obsessed with loyalty, honor, and lineage. For men accused of crimes linked to a king's wife, the message was even sharper. Their supposed offenses were not just political. They were presented as violations of the royal body and household. A sentence answered that by turning their own bodies into warnings. Piece by piece, the man who had once walked freely at court was reduced to an object lesson in what happened when someone was judged to have crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Even without dwelling on graphic detail, it is clear how calculated this was. Everything happened in front of witnesses, officials, guards, and crowds who would carry the story back into streets, taverns, and homes. People did not need to see every movement clearly to understand what was being done. They could hear reactions, see the executioner's gestures, and know that the law was being carried out to its furthest edge. The traitor, still conscious for part of this, became both victim and instrument suffering, but also serving as a tool to reinforce fear. As the punishment went on, the distance between this and an ordinary execution grew wider. A standard hanging removed a man from the world. This process dismantled him in front of it. It was a way of saying that treason did not just cost a life. It cost dignity, privacy, and even the right to vanish quickly. For those tied to Henry's queens, that mattered. Their alleged betrayal was framed as intimate, a stain that touched the monarchy at its most personal point. In response, their end was made just as personal, cutting deeper than a single blow or a silent drop ever could. By the time this stage was complete, the condemned man was often past the point of real awareness. Shock, blood loss, and exhaustion dulled everything. But for the people watching, the message remained sharp. The king's justice did not stop with declaring guilt or ordering death. It reached into the body and made a spectacle of unmaking it. And it was not over yet. There was still one more step, one final transformation that would ensure the traitor's story did not end neatly at the scaffold, but continued in pieces scattered across the kingdom as a lasting physical reminder of what the crown could do. Once the body had been pushed to its limits, the final part of the traitor's sentence answered a different question. Not, how will he die? But, how will he be remembered? In Tudor England, memory was not just written in chronicles. It was nailed above gates and rotting on roadside beams. The last stage of the punishment took whatever was left of the condemned man and turned it into a warning that people would pass beneath, day after day, long after the crowd at the scaffold had gone home. For those who suffered the full penalty, death itself was almost an afterthought. Once life finally left the body, whether on the rope, under the executioner's hand, or in the chaos of the final blows, the man no longer had any say in what happened. The authorities moved from punishing a living traitor to arranging the remains of a defeated one. The torso was divided, the body separated into distinct parts. This was not done in secret. Officials recorded where each piece was sent, because each destination had a purpose. Different quarters might be dispatched to different towns or regions connected to the condemned man's life. A piece could be sent to a place where he had held influence, held office, or enjoyed local loyalty. There, it would be mounted in a prominent public spot on the gate of a city, at a bridge, near a main road where travelers passed. People crossing under those grisly markers would know the name attached to them, and more importantly, the charge: treason. The man who had once moved freely through those streets would return only as a mutilated symbol of defeat. The head received its own special treatment. Before it was displayed, it was often treated with substances like tar to delay decay, keeping the features recognizable for longer. In London, one of the most famous places for such displays was London Bridge. Spikes were set above the stone arches, and the heads of executed traitors were fixed there for all who crossed the river to see. Merchants, nobles, servants, and travelers, all passing beneath a row of faces that had once belonged to men of rank, now reduced to trophies of royal authority. It turned the city itself into a kind of open-air warning. For a man like Francis Dereham, this final stage was where Henry's anger became part of the landscape. His head did not simply vanish into a grave. It was raised above the water, exposed to wind and weather, forcing anyone entering or leaving the city to confront what had been done to someone accused of touching the king's wife. Over time, the features would fade, birds would pick at what remained, and eventually the elements would claim it. But for weeks or months, that head told a story more clearly than any proclamation. The king's reach did not end with the moment of death. By the time the last of a traitor's remains had fallen or been taken down, his body had been used in every possible way as a legal subject, a victim of punishment, and finally a sign. Nothing about the process was accidental. Each step, from sentence to scattering, was meant to show that treason against Henry VIII did not just cost a life. It shattered a man, divided him, and spread the pieces across the realm so that no one could miss the message. In the next segment of your video, when you shift back to Henry's choices in psychology, this becomes the foundation. The king was not just killing his enemies. He was rewriting their existence, turning their broken bodies into instruments of fear and control. By the time Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were sentenced, Henry VIII was not just an aging king with a broken marriage track record. He was a man who believed that his very body and honor had been attacked from the inside of his own bedchamber. Years earlier, with Anne Boleyn, suspicion had destroyed an entire circle of men around her. Now, with Catherine Howard, the pattern returned, but sharper. Henry had once called Catherine his rose without a thorn, learning that other men had been close to her before, and in Culpeper's case, possibly during the marriage, did not just wound his pride. It humiliated him in front of his court, his allies, and foreign powers who watched every move he made. That is why the fates of Dereham and Culpeper were carefully separated, even though both were condemned in the same case. On paper, each man had committed treason tied to the Queen. In practice, Henry's feelings carved a gulf between them. Culpeper was a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, a man who had long enjoyed the king's favor. His alleged intimacy with Catherine was dangerous, but it belonged to the period when she was already queen, when Henry had chosen her and placed her at the center of his world. For that, Culpeper would lose his life, but he would keep, in a twisted way, the dignity of his rank. A clean beheading acknowledged his status, even as it erased him. Francis Dereham, though, represented something Henry could not forgive or control. Dereham belonged to Catherine's life before the crown, those years in her grandmother's household when no one imagined she would become a queen. By claiming that he and Catherine had spoken of each other as husband and wife, and that they had been physically intimate, Dereham forced everyone to confront a question Henry could not bear. Had he ever truly possessed what he thought he had married? In a culture where a queen's purity was tied directly to the king's image, Dereham became the man who had touched what Henry believed should always have been his alone. That is why the full, drawn-out traitor's punishment fell on Dereham, and not on Culpeper. The law provided the structure, but the king's rage chose who would stand where on that scale. Culpeper's end was swift. Dereham's was built to linger in the memory of everyone who saw it or heard about it. One man's death said, "No favored is safe if he oversteps." The other said, "Anyone who lays claim to the king's wife in any time of her life will be broken in the most public way possible." Even in their final moments, Henry was sorting them friend and outsider, gentleman and lesser man, present threat and unforgivable past. For your final segment, this is the emotional core to lean on. Henry was using the law not just to remove two men, but to rewrite the story of his own wounded pride. A gradation of mercy he showed was not random. It revealed exactly who he blamed, what part of Catherine's life enraged him most, and how he wanted the world to understand the price of ever being close to a woman who wore his crown. When Henry turned suspicion into policy, the executions around his queens stopped being isolated tragedies and became part of a larger strategy of control. What happened to the men accused of touching Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard was not just about personal rage. It was a message broadcast to every courtier who dared to get too close to royal power. One accusation could pull you from the heart of the king's favor straight to the edge of a scaffold, and what happened on that scaffold depended entirely on how Henry chose to remember you. That uncertainty kept everyone around him slightly afraid, which was exactly how a paranoid ruler wanted his court to feel. You can see this pattern if you set the fates of Anne's accused lovers beside those of Catherine. The men around Anne, Norris, Weston, Brereton, George Bulling, and Smeaton, were formally sentenced to the full traitor's death, but Henry stepped in and changed it. Their punishment was commuted to beheading, still brutal, but relatively swift and reserved for those whose rank or usefulness once mattered. Years later, with Catherine Howard, he repeated the same split decision. Thomas Culpeper, the gentleman, and former favorite, received the gentler end, while Francis Derham, the man tied to Catherine's premarital past, suffered the harshest version the law could offer. The pattern is clear. The closer a man's alleged crime came to Henry's pride and sense of ownership over his wife, the more completely his body and memory were destroyed. At the same time, these executions fed into a wider climate of fear that defined Henry's later reign. People at court watched heads go up on London Bridge and knew exactly whose they were. They heard reports of what had happened at Tyburn or Tower Hill, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. More distance, more caution, more silence. Historians estimate that tens of thousands died under Henry's rule through executions of various kinds, and the highly staged deaths of men around his queens became some of the most talked about. They reinforced the idea that treason was not just plotting with enemies or raising armies. It could be as simple as a rumor, a look, or a past relationship that the king decided to reinterpret. For your video, this section can act as the hinge between the physical horror You've already described and the psychological horror you will explore next. The audience has seen what the punishment looked like. Now you are showing why it was used the way it was. Henry was not killing at random. He was sending layered messages to foreign ambassadors that he would not tolerate any shadow over his marriages, to his subjects that the monarchy was sacred, and to the men in his own chambers that their status would not save them if they ever became inconvenient. The difference between a sword on Tower Hill and the full brutality at Tyburn was Henry's verdict on a man's place in his story. By the time Henry was done with Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, it was clear that guilt at his court didn't he always mean what it sounded like. On paper, the men around them were condemned as traitors who had plotted against the crown. In reality, many of them were more like collateral damage in a story the king needed to be true. For Anne's circle, most modern historians agree, there was no solid evidence of adultery at all. The supposed relationships, the dates, even the accusations of incest with her brother George, looked more like a carefully built case than anything that actually happened. But once Mark Smeaton's confession existed, the rest of the story could be forced into place, and 5 men paid the price for a queen Henry wanted gone. With Catherine Howard, the lines blur in a different way. Catherine really had a past before Henry, a chaotic youth, inappropriate relationships, and a serious entanglement with Francis Derham. There is also strong suggestion of dangerous intimacy with Thomas Culpeper while she was queen. But even here, the way the law was used goes far beyond the facts. Derham's relationship with Catherine took place years before Henry ever considered marrying her. Culpeper's meetings with her, whatever they involved, were wrapped in secrecy and pressure from a power structure Catherine struggled to navigate. Instead of asking how much choice she had, Henry's counselors treated every connection as deliberate betrayal and turned the two men into symbols of that decision. What ties both sets of executions together is how little room they left for doubt. Once suspicion attached itself to the king's wife, the men around her were almost guaranteed to fall. In Anne's case, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and George Bullen walked to the scaffold, insisting they were innocent, and nothing they said changed their fate. In Catherine's, Derham tried to argue the law, that his bond with her belonged to another time, that it made her marriage to the king questionable rather than treasonous. Culpeper tried to limit what he admitted to, hoping that drawing a line might save him. None of that mattered. The trials were not about testing the truth. They were about confirming a version of events that protected the king's pride and authority. For your audience, this is where the real horror of Henry's justice sinks in. The methods of execution were terrifying, but the deeper fear comes from understanding how easily someone could slide from favor to death with almost no real evidence. A joking remark taken the wrong way, a rumor from years ago, a relationship that once felt private all of it, could be rewritten as proof of treason if the king needed it to be. In Anne's story, that meant a group of likely innocent men dying for crimes they probably never committed. In Catherine's, it meant two flawed, complicated figures, Derham and Culpeper, trapped in a system that cared less about what they had, actually done and more about how their pasts could be used to explain the king's rage. If Segment 3 showed how Henry could break a man's body, this part of Segment 4 shows how he broke the idea of justice around his marriages. The men accused of touching his wives were not just punished. They were rewritten. Their motives, their choices, even their memories were swallowed by a single, brutal narrative. The king has been wronged, and someone must pay. In your final section, you can take this one step further, asking what it did to the court, and to history itself, that so many lives and reputations were reshaped to protect one man's image. By the time the Tower gates closed on Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, everyone at court understood one thing. When a queen fell, the men around her were already marked. The stories of Norris, Weston, Brereton, George Bullen, Smeaton, Derham, and Culpeper didn't just end with their deaths. Their fates settled like a shadow over the rest of Henry's reign. Courtiers learned to move differently more distance from the queen. Fewer private jokes, no careless words that could ever be twisted into too much familiarity. Proximity to a king's wife had once been a sign of favor. After these scandals, it looked more like a loaded weapon. In the years that followed, the message spread far beyond the palace walls. Ambassadors reported back to foreign courts about a king who could turn on his own household with terrifying speed, who answered whispers with executions, and displayed the results above his own capital's bridge. Ordinary Londoners walked beneath the places where traitors. Heads had been fixed and told, and retold the stories of how they got there. Over time, those stories blurred details, but one idea stayed sharp. Henry's honor, especially in his marriages, was something people died for. Not just queens, but the men accused of ever having touched them. For history, that has left a strange legacy. The official records speak in the language of treason and law, but behind those words are half-glimpsed human lives. A musician who may have broken under pressure, a brother condemned with his sister, a young queen with a chaotic past, a lover who tried to argue the law and lost. Their voices survive only in fragments, trial notes, letters, hostile reports, most of them written by people who needed Henry's version of events to stand. That's why, centuries later, historians still argue over what really happened, who was truly guilty of anything more than bad luck, bad judgment, or being in the wrong place when the king changed his mind. For your viewers, the deepest chill sits here at the end of the story. Henry VIII did not need to prove, beyond all doubt, that these men had done what he accused them of. He only needed their deaths to make sense of his own decisions. to justify setting aside one wife, destroying another, and purging anyone who made him feel mocked, betrayed, or less than absolute. The men accused of touching his queens suffered in their bodies, but they also lost something else, the right to define their own lives. Their memories were edited to fit a single narrative in which the king was always the wronged figure, and they were always the necessary sacrifice. As the video closes, you can leave the audience with that uncomfortable thought. In Henry's world, the worst fate wasn't just to die. It was to have your story taken away. A queen could go from beloved to condemned in a matter of weeks. The men around her could go from trusted to traitors just as fast. And once the axe fell, the only version of events that mattered was the one that kept the king's power intact. How many of them were truly monsters, and how many were simply erased to protect the pride of one man, is a question history can't fully answer, but it is exactly the kind of question that keeps the Tudor darkness alive in people's minds today.